Hi, my name's Kevin Birmingham. I'm the executive director at the Journey Neighbourhood Centre, and one of my responsibilities is to go out into the community and represent the Journey, to talk to service clubs and corporations and organizations about the neighborhood that we serve, who the Journey is, what we do, what our dreams and plans are for the future. And I thought I do this a lot for service clubs, and it might be worthwhile actually putting it onto video. I'll warn you, this could be the world's most boring video. There's going to be lots of statistics, but I will try and tell some stories to maybe perk it up a little and make it a little bit more engaging and interesting. So the first thing I really need to talk about is the community that we serve. The Journey Neighbourhood Centres, because we do have two locations, are located in a part of Brampton that I've always called a challenged community. And I do that, I suppose, in some ways to be polite about it. There are many challenges that the people in our community face. There's a lot of difficulties there. And the people there in the community are doing the best they can, facing some very difficult situations. So I want to talk a little bit about the community first. We're located in Brampton, in an area that is part of the Queen Kennedy corridor. We're surrounded by Queen Street to the north and Clarence to the south and Kennedy Road to the east and the Etobicoke Creek to the west. And within that community, we have a population of 3,838 people. Now, maybe today there's 39 or maybe there's 36. I don't know. But when the census was taken the other year, that's how many people they found. There are 1,475 dwellings in the community. 53%, and this is an important number, 53% of the people in the community live in apartments. They don't own their home, they rent. So that's just a teeny bit over half the population in our community live in apartments. There are, and this number I find a little suspect. According to Stats Canada, there are 1,000 family households. How you can have an even number, I don't know, but then maybe that's not all that much different than saying there are 3,838 people. So there are 1,000 households, 53%. So a little bit over half the households are single-parent households, and of that, most of them are women in the community. And I think that's a very, very important statistic to keep in mind when we look at the rest of this. 53% are single-parent households. The community we're in, this next slide, when it comes up on the screen, is a little bit self-defeating for me. See, the community that I'm in, Ardglen, Orenda Court, has a reputation in Brampton, and it's not a good reputation. Yet, I don't think it's a fair reputation that they've got. And so back when I first did this show, probably about 7 years ago, I looked up the crime statistic map for the region of Peel, and specifically our community, and I was able to point to people and say, well, actually, we're a very low crime area. So yes, we have a reputation, but when you look at crime, it's actually not that bad. Well, when I recently redid the show, I looked at the crime map and discovered that we are in the only hotspot in all of Brampton for criminal activity. And when you look at this slide that we've put up, you'll see that we are the dark orange area. The Journey is located right in the middle of it. You can see there's two little stars, one at our Orenda Court Centre and one at our Ardglen Centre, and we're right in the midst of it. I'm still going to argue, though, that the neighborhood is filled with mostly good people. The vast majority of people in our community are good people who are just trying to do the best they can, to live the best life they can. And yes, there is a concentration of crime in the region, A lot of it has to do with the Queen Street, Kennedy intersection area. But yeah, we're there. And it does make it difficult. It makes it difficult sometimes to work in the community because there's a lot of safety issues for people. But we're not as bad as the reputation that we have. There are a lot of things that the community is known for, and there's two in particular. One was the shooting death of Keyshawn Williams. It'll be, it's 10 years ago, this past January 23rd. Keyshawn was 9 years old. He was sitting in his living room. It was late in the evening. He was watching TV. And he was in a townhouse where the backyard faced the street, and somebody walked up the slope and shot through the patio door window, and he was killed. They'd only lived in that townhouse for about 4 or 5 days. The agreement is that it was a drug-related shooting and that the previous tenants were known drug dealers. Obviously, a 9-year-old boy was not the target. That I'm sure somebody else was. But that was a horrendous tragedy. The other thing that we're known for is the fire. I started actually in May of 2014, and 3 weeks later, a whole townhouse unit, 18 units burned, and a little boy, Nicholas Gabriel, died in that fire. Because the journey is literally just half a block away. Our parking lot, our plaza that we're in, became the response area for the fire. Everybody came. We ended up having to deal with it. We set up a trust fund, distributed funds and that. But those two are bigger tragedies. I mean, there's been, I think, 5 children who have died tragically in the neighborhood. I've been there 8-9 years now, and there's at least 6 fires that we've had, not nearly as extensive as that one. So there's been a lot of challenges that way within the community. I think this next slide that I'm going to talk about really gives a good picture of what's going on. So 15% of the families in our community are considered low income as defined by the government. The government's definition of low income, I would call that closer to extreme poverty. I would say there's far more than 15% are in a low income situation, especially given inflation and the cost of housing. The average family income in the area is $68,000 a year. In the region of Peel, it's $94,000 a year. So that's a significant gap in income. 25% of the people in the community who are working are in either casual or temporary or some kind of fixed term employment. In other words, their employment is precarious. And that becomes a real challenge in the community because you might have a job today and then nothing tomorrow. 40% of the people in the community are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And that's really important because basically they say realistically, you should be spending 30% or less on housing, and 40% are spending more, which means they have less money for food. They have less money for clothing and for transportation. And quite frankly, many of them live in housing that I would not want to live in. They have landlords that take advantage of their vulnerability. They are abused tenants in the community. 43% of the people in our community are immigrants. They come from Jamaica, from Africa, primarily Nigeria, South Asia, and Portugal. The area that our Ardglen Center is in was originally a Portuguese community. Now it's changing, and where our Orenda Center is, it's primarily a Black and South Asian community. It is a highly mobile community. 45% of the people over the last 5 years have moved in our community, 45%. And 53% of the people have no post-secondary education. And these things all tie together. If you don't have the education, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to get the best jobs. If you don't have the best jobs, then you end up in a situation where you're dealing with poverty, you're dealing with precarious employment, you're dealing with housing that you really can't afford. It just spirals and it becomes a bigger and bigger challenge for the people in the community. On the well-being index, there's a lot of factors that make up a well-being index, factors such as safety, employment, transportation, housing, the services that are available in your community. And on this slide, you can see that the community that the Journey centers are in rates 21, which is in the bottom part of the scale. The scale only goes down to 15. I don't know what happens lower than 15, but based on census tract data, we're in the very bottom. And the community just north of us, and the thing is that, yes, there are boundaries of where the Journey is, but the Journey serves a much larger community than that. We have people coming from far away as Caledon and from Mississauga for some of the services that we offer. So the community just north of us, just north of Queen Street, is only 22. So we are in a community that has only the Knightsbridge community has a lower rating than ours as far as well-being of living. So what's our story? So our story goes back, actually, I think to 2011. I think I've lied on the slide. It says 2012, but it goes back to 2011 when Ted Brown, who's the director of Regeneration, which is a ministry primarily focused on homelessness and food distribution in the community. He took Jamie Holtom, who's the pastor of this church where I'm shooting this video in, on a tour of what I would call challenged communities in Brampton. And when they got to the Ardglen Orenda community, it really spoke to Jamie's heart. You may not know exactly where the community is, but that's where the Pio Memorial Hospital is. It's just right there in our community. I can see the building from the Journey. And his children were born there. And he used to play basketball in the community. So it was a community that he had been around, but he had no idea what was going on. He did not realize the challenges that people were facing. And his heart went out and he said, we got to do something. So the church formed a little committee called Community in Action, and they started working in the community. They partnered with the school and offered a reading program called Superstar Readers for children in grade 1 through 3. They started doing clothing drives in the community. They'd bring people back here to the church on a Sunday evening to serve them a meal. They just did all that they could. And going back to Keyshawn Williams' death, that was a seminal moment. See, the church had already been working in the community for a year or so and had gotten a reputation. And so when Keyshawn was killed, they were asked to do a memorial service, and they did it right. They blocked off Ardglen, and they did that memorial on a February night right there on that street for that community. And between that moment and another seminal moment where they were at a parent-teacher meeting at the school, and one of the parents said, you know, organizations come here all the time, and they promise us this, and they promise us that, and they're going to do this, and then they disappear. They raise our hopes, and then they just dash them to the ground when they disappear. Either be here or don't be here. And so between Keyshawn's death and that literally throwing down of the gauntlet by a parent in the community, North Bramalea realized that they needed to move into the community, that it was not enough to be visiting the community. And so the search began and the Journey neighborhood was started. Keyshawn's death was in January. The Journey opened in November. That was so seminal to what created the Journey neighborhood centers as we know them today. We are collaborative. North Bramalea United Church, Rapport Youth and Family Services, Regeneration Community Outreach, Bridgeway, YMCA. It goes on and on. The list is far longer than what's on this slide. We work with anybody and everybody who would serve our community and the people in it because we care about the community. We are the community. We hire from the community. We get volunteers from the community. We are Ardglen and Orenda Court. And so we will collaborate with anybody and everybody who has something that they can offer and give to the community. We also have a wide variety of funding sources. The United Way has been funding the Journey since the day the doors opened. The United Church of Canada funds us. Service clubs like Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, community foundations like the Brampton and Caledon Community Foundation, North Bramalea United Church, Capital Park, on and on and on. All kinds of organizations have drawn alongside of us and fund us and help us provide the services that our community needs. One cannot talk about what we do and not talk about COVID. I'll never forget, it was Friday the 13th, Friday, March the 13th, 2020. COVID had been spreading. That was March break week, and normally we would do a March break club. And we couldn't. We knew that we just couldn't offer the program. In fact, we weren't even sure whether we could be open or not. So we tied our opening and closing to a decision by the school board. If the schools closed, we would close. And even though on Friday the 13th they hadn't made the announcement, we knew that they were going to. And so we suspended 13 programs that were running in our two centers. Orenda Court, the management there, because we literally rent an apartment in a tower, and the management there said, we do not want you running programs in the tower. We can't have people congregating in our building. And in fact, it wasn't until this past fall, the fall of 2022, that we were finally able to reopen our center. We paid rent for all those years on that apartment so that we could keep it, because we were not going to be the agency that disappeared on the people of our community. We pivoted. We started distributing food and grocery cards. We offered online after-school programming, that first summer we had a virtual summer camp. Have you ever virtual bowled? We bought all the kids, every kid that was enrolled, we sent kits home with them, and one of them was one of those plastic bowling things, and we actually had a bowling tournament online with the kids and that. We did everything that we could in order to facilitate our community and keep doing what we were doing. Toys for Tots, we still ran it, but instead of having a big party, we had a table outside, and the families came. We coordinated with them to pick up the toys for the kids. Our big Easter hunt, we just got baggies and filled them with chocolate, put a little card in and said, this is from the Journey, and hid them all through the neighborhood and announced it on Facebook. Anything and everything that we could to continue to serve our community. And there was still a gap, but we did what we could, because we had to, because the people need and want those services from us. So today, well, we've been able to reopen both centers. We're running after-school programming at both centers. We're also back into the school again. One of the 13 programs we suspended was an after-school program in Sir Winston Churchill. So we've got 3 programs running for after school. The Winston Churchill one is actually on leadership and skills development for the children. Bridgeway has their program for parents and preschoolers. Hammer Band is still doing their violin lessons. We have women's drop-ins in both locations. We have a sewing club. And Eclipse has just arrived with their youth work program to work out of the Journey. We're doing community events. We've held 2 community barbecues, which is more than just having food. We survey the community, and we also have other organizations have displays up so that they can meet the people in our community, and the community people can find out what other services are available for them to help them. So we're doing all kinds of events, summer camp, the barbecues, workshops, whatever we need and to do that we can for the community. I want to talk a little bit about the children in our community because they're, when we first opened the journey, we surveyed the community and said, so what are your priorities? And the number one priority we heard by a mile was we were really concerned about our children's education. We really need them to get the help. We can't always help them. And so there are 1,405 children and youth in our immediate neighborhood. 45% of them, almost half of them, live in a single-parent home. And according to the Region Appeal, 35% of the children in our community are not ready for school before they enter into kindergarten. And that basically means maybe they aren't toilet trained, or they haven't learned their alphabet yet, or basic behavioral skills. They're just not ready to be in school. So the children in our community, before they even start on their educational track, are already at a disadvantage in a difficult situation. These next statistics are a little sobering. Sir Winston Churchill, according to the Fraser Institute, is in the bottom 10% when it comes to the EQAO tests in the entire province. The other school in our community, St. Mary, is just a tiny bit better. The last tests that were done this past year, you can see up on the screen the grade 3s at Sir Winston Churchill. Only 18% of the children actually reached standard level in mathematics, only 17% in reading, and only 22% in writing. And I was talking recently to somebody who's from the school board, and he said my statistics were rather generous, that it isn't as good as that. I looked it up, and during COVID, it really set the children back. And you can see that only 55% of them have internet access at home. Only 45% of them have access to a computer. And this is, by the way, most of the time. 50% have a tablet. As you know, the schools gave out Chromebooks, as did the Journey. We bought 26 Chromebooks to give out to families. And then we're actually just coming to the end of a program that we ran with the library where we gave out even more. I think we gave out another 10 Chromebooks. Only 50% have access, which leaves me wondering, because this was last year still during COVID. So if only half of them had access to something, where were the Chromebooks for them? And only 25% have access to a smartphone of any kind. So the children are way below standard, and they do not have access to the tools that we tend to use nowadays in order to reach any kind of standard. COVID had a huge impact on the children. It says here, I'm reading, evidence suggests that on average, students made less academic progress during pandemic-related closures. You don't need a study to know that. You just talk to any parent and they'll tell you their kids are behind. This is a quote from the United States, but it applies here. Low-income students, Black and Latinx students, students with special education needs, and English language learners have fallen disproportionately behind. Well, that describes our community. That is the community we serve, and they've fallen disproportionately behind. Now, COVID, yes, had an impact on the children academically, but that isn't the only impact it had on them. It also impacted their mental health. They ended up isolated from their friends. They didn't have the same opportunity. And those 53% of the children who are in a single-parent home are dealing with a parent who at this point is overwhelmed. So they're not necessarily living in an environment that is conducive to good mental health. Also, they lost out on socialization skills. It's hard to socialize on a Zoom call. Trust me, I've been there. I know that. Another impact that it had that people may not realize is a nutritional impact. Because when the schools were closed, the breakfast programs were turned down. There's been more than one child that has arrived at the Journey for an after-school program, and the snack we've given them is the first food that they've had that day. Finally, this inequity gap. Our neighborhood is a neighborhood that is poor, racialized, and has a lot of children with special needs. And they've fallen even further behind. The children in our community face huge challenges, which is part of the reason why we're there, why we do the after-school programming with them. So what's the future? This is the final slide, by the way. If you've hung in there all the way to this point, I congratulate you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So what's the future for the Journey? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Eclipse has moved in. They run youth service programs, and they have moved into the Journey as of today. In fact, when I finish filming this, I'm going back to haul furniture into the Journey. And they run youth programs, I think from 13 to the early 20s of all kinds. They have expertise in this whole area. I would encourage you to watch a video with Tamika Malcolm that will be coming up. Well, if you see this one, it's on our YouTube site, okay? And she is a youth worker with Eclipse, and you'll be inspired by what you hear from her. We want to do a tutoring program. After-school homework help is useful, but it is not the same as tutoring. And so we are looking, tutoring is not a cheap thing to offer. It just blows away our children's programming budget. And so we're looking at grants and seeking funds because we know that tutoring is so important for our kids, especially because they've fallen so far behind. We're developing community leadership. We have a grant specifically from the United Way and we have a worker in the community who's identifying people who we can help become community leaders, because really the growth and the change has to come from within the community. We're doing advocacy. We want more staff. We've been running short staff because, quite frankly, with COVID, we've had to be careful with our funding and our expenditures, and we need to be fiscally responsible. Community workshops, and just recently, in fact, this may be a teeny bit premature, but we're actually starting on the road of offering counseling services. We have someone who's coming in. We've already got more people signed up than slots available, but a huge problem for our community is that so many people need counseling. They can't afford counseling, and there's so few free counseling services available, and the waiting lists are forever. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for hanging through to the end of this. I want to ask you to think of our community, think of the work of the Journey, think of what we do. Pray for us. We will be expanding everything that we're doing, so we'll be looking for volunteers, we'll be looking for donors, we'll be looking for people who have the care and compassion that we do for the people that we work with, for the people who are the Journey. So thank you so much. Take care. God bless.